You've seen the photo before. The white Dutch colonial house with two windows shaped like eyes, gazing across a quiet street in Long Island. You've probably scrolled past it at night, maybe even paused for a second before moving on. But if you stare at that image long enough, something strange happens. You begin to feel that the house is staring back. And if I told you that everything you're about to hear is real, every name, every hour, every body that fell asleep and never woke up, you might start to wonder if a house can hold on to hate. Because hatred doesn't vanish when its owner dies. It lingers. It seeps into wood and brick and soil, like smoke trapped under skin. So tonight, before we begin, lock your doors, lower the lights, because by the time this story ends, you'll never look at your home the same way again. November 13th, 1974, Amityville, Long Island. A soft fog hung low over Ocean Avenue that night. The streetlights cast thin halos across the pavement, and the only sounds were the occasional lap of water from the nearby canal and the distant hum of a passing car. Behind the white picket fences, the houses slept. Except one. At number 112 stood a two-story colonial with a steep roof and twin windows that looked almost human. Eyes half shut in a tired squint. Locals used to say that the house watched the street. They meant it as a joke. But that night, the house did see. It saw Ronald DeFeo Jr., 23 years old, rise from his bed, walk to a closet, and pull out his Marlin rifle. It saw him cross the hallway, room by room, the sound of each step muffled by the carpet. At 3:15 a.m., the stillness shattered. By dawn, 6 bodies lay perfectly still. Father, mother, and 4 children. Each one face down, hands at their sides, as though they'd simply decided not to wake up. The strangest part? No one heard a thing. Not the neighbors, not even those in the next room. A rifle that loud should have woken the entire block, but it didn't. No screams, no movement, just a silence so complete it felt orchestrated. When the police entered, they found the bodies neatly arranged, the beds made around them, the rooms untouched except for the stains seeping into the sheets. In one corner, a clock had stopped, frozen at 3:15. The next morning, Ronald walked into Henry's bar down the street, shaking, his eyes glassy, and shouted, "My father and mother are shot!" He cried, he screamed, he played his role well. But by that evening, the mask began to crack. The stories shifted. First, he said it was the mob. Then he said a shadow. Then, the voices. In his confession, he described them as whispers that grew louder until they were inside his skull, coaxing his hands to move. "Once I started, I couldn't stop," he said. "It was like someone was controlling me." The trial turned into a spectacle. Some called it insanity, others possession. Newspapers printed headlines dripping with suggestion. Evil in Amityville. But no matter the verdict, one truth remained. The house had seen something terrible, and it would see more. A year later, in December 1975, the property went up for sale. The broker hesitated to list it, unsure how to price something so infamous. $80,000, far below its worth, for 5 bedrooms, a private dock, and a large yard facing the water. Everyone in town knew the story. Everyone, except the people who decided to buy it. George and Kathy Lutz, a newly married couple, practical, optimistic, raising 3 children. George, a businessman with a trimmed beard and a quiet intensity. Kathy, warm and devoted, a mother who believed in order and light. They saw the house as a fresh start, a dream made real. When asked if they worried about its past, George laughed. "Ghosts don't pay the bills." On December 18th, the family moved in. The first day felt perfect. Winter sunlight filtered through the windows, and the house smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. They carried boxes, unpacked photos, played music. A priest, Father Ralph Pecoraro, stopped by to bless the home. He moved room to room, murmuring prayers. In one upstairs bedroom, the one where the DeFeo boys had once slept, he felt a sudden chill. The air pressed around him like a hand. Then, from behind, a voice hissed, "Get out!" He did. He stumbled downstairs, pale, trembling, telling George nothing except, "Don't use that room." He drove away and never returned. That night, he fell ill with fever and blisters on his hands. The Lutz family didn't hear from him again. For the first few nights, the house was calm. Then came the cold. Not the kind that creeps under doors, but a deep, impossible cold that sank into their bones. The fireplace couldn't warm it. Blankets didn't help. The thermostat stayed high. Yet the rooms breathed frost. George began waking at 3:15 every night, always the same time. He'd hear something, a distant sound, maybe a drum beat or footsteps in the hall. He'd wander downstairs, only to find the house perfectly still, except for the faint scent of something burnt. Kathy noticed changes in him. He stopped shaving. His eyes grew sunken. He sat for hours by the fire, staring into the flames as if waiting for something to move inside them. When she spoke to him, sometimes he didn't answer. Sometimes he repeated words under his breath that didn't belong to him. Then came the flies. Hundreds of them, clinging to the window of the sewing room. It was midwinter, freezing outside, yet the flies swarmed in thick clusters, buzzing until the sound filled the house like static. Kathy killed them all one afternoon. The next morning, they were back. Downstairs, doors slammed with no wind. Upstairs, the children spoke to someone unseen. Their youngest daughter began mentioning a friend, Jody. She said Jody was kind and that Jody had red glowing eyes. One afternoon, Kathy found her giggling at the window, waving at something outside. She saw nothing. The little girl said, "Jody doesn't like you looking at her." At first, George and Kathy tried to rationalize. They blamed the cold, the stress, the power of suggestion. But each night grew worse. Sometimes, the walls would hum. Other times, the air smelled of decay, like rotting fruit or old blood. The black stains reappeared no matter how many times they were scrubbed. The dog Harry began to act strangely, barking at corners, whining at empty doorways. Once, George found him strangled by his leash, barely conscious, as if something had tried to pull him down the steps of the boathouse. Kathy dreamed of the DeFeos. She said she saw the mother kneeling by the bed, praying, while the shadow of a man raised a gun behind her. When she woke, her body was covered in scratches. You can almost feel the tension building. That slow, inevitable collapse where belief and fear start to overlap. A place becomes a mind becomes a place. And something inside that house wanted to blur the line completely. Each morning, George grew colder, more distant. He chopped wood obsessively, as if driven by unseen orders. The sound of the axe echoed across the yard, rhythmic, relentless. Neighbors began avoiding the house. They said they could hear shouting, sometimes laughter, though the Lutzes were often away. Then came the night Kathy woke to find George standing over her, eyes open, face blank, whispering, "It's not them, it's me." She didn't ask what it meant. The next evening, the family gathered in the living room to pray. As Kathy recited a verse, a sudden force slammed the window behind her shut so hard the glass cracked. The temperature dropped instantly. The children screamed. George said later that he felt something move through the room. A rush of air that wasn't air. Something thick, aware, cold enough to numb his skin. By the fourth week, they were barely sleeping. Shadows crawled across the ceilings. Doors banged. The smell of sulfur filled the hallways. George swore he heard the marching band again, only now it was louder, filling the entire house. Brass instruments blaring, a drum beat shaking the floorboards. When he opened the door, the noise stopped. Total silence. It was on the 28th day that they finally broke. January 14th, 1976. The storm outside was fierce. Wind hammered the roof. The walls groaned. Kathy said she saw figures in the hallway, silhouettes moving toward the children's rooms. George shouted, lights flickered, and then something, a voice, a pressure, a command, rose through the house all at once. Get out. They ran. No luggage, no shoes, just panic. They fled through the front door into the freezing rain, leaving everything behind. Food on the table, dishes half cleaned, a pot still warm on the stove. When police entered days later, they found the lights on, windows open, and muddy footprints climbing the stairs, stopping outside the master bedroom, and vanishing mid-step. No one slept inside that house again. The police report from that night was brief, too brief. Officers described a scene that looked abandoned in haste, lights still burning, furniture undisturbed, a half-eaten meal congealed on the kitchen table, the imprint of a hand still visible in the dust. There was no evidence of forced entry, no signs of burglary, nothing to explain why a family would vanish into the cold at 3 a.m. What the report didn't mention were the details whispered among the responding officers. The smell that lingered, sulfur, mixed with something sweet and wrong. The strange patches of ice in the middle of warm rooms. The sense, as one policeman later told a friend, that the house was holding its breath. The Lutz family never returned to 112 Ocean Avenue. They stayed in a motel, then fled the state entirely. In interviews, George's voice always shook when he tried to describe what had happened. He never gave specifics, never fully claimed ghosts. Instead, he used phrases like, the house was alive, and something in there wanted us dead. Within weeks, their story exploded. Newspapers called it the Amityville Horror. Reporters camped outside the house, cameras flashing day and night. For every skeptic, there was a believer. For every believer, a dozen who wanted to feel the chill themselves. Enter Ed and Lorraine Warren, self-proclaimed demonologists, veterans of hauntings from Connecticut to Rhode Island. They arrived at the house in March 1976, long after the Lutzes had gone, armed with cameras, tape recorders, and relics of faith. Lorraine would later say that stepping through that door was like walking into a refrigerator full of sorrow. She described seeing shadows dart along the ceiling, feeling hands touch her shoulders when no one was near. Ed claimed his crucifix shook violently in his hand. Whatever is here, he said on tape, is not human. That night, one of their infrared cameras captured an image. A small boy peering from a doorway, pale-faced, eyes glowing white. No children had been present. The investigators swore it wasn't staged. Even skeptics who debunked every other claim hesitated with that photo. There's something about it. The innocence, the emptiness, that feels wrong. After the Warrens' investigation, the house fell quiet again. No further hauntings, no more screams. Just silence. The new owners reported nothing unusual. To some, that proved it was all a hoax. To others, it meant the house had chosen. Meanwhile, the Lutzes became reluctant celebrities. Interviews, book deals, late-night shows. In 1977, Jay Anson's The Amityville Horror, a true story, was published. Part confession, part nightmare. It sold millions of copies. 2 years later came the film, and with it, a new wave of curiosity. Tourists flocked to Long Island. They took photos, whispered outside the gate. Some daring to touch the fence before running back to their cars. The town hated the attention. Ocean Avenue became a spectacle of morbid fascination. Children dared each other to stand in front of the house after dark. None lasted long, but beyond the myths and Hollywood versions, certain facts refused to fade. Why were all 6 DeFeo victims found lying face down, hands neatly at their sides, with no signs of struggle? Why didn't a single neighbor hear 7 gunshots echo through the walls? Why did the clock stop at the exact hour the killings occurred? The same time George Lutz would later wake each night. No one has answers. Science dismisses it as coincidence. The faithful call it possession. The curious just keep asking, and the house somehow keeps listening. Years passed. The address was changed to discourage visitors. The distinctive quarter-moon windows, the eyes, were replaced with square panes, giving the facade a new blank expression. But even stripped of its face, the house retained its weight. Locals swear the atmosphere shifts when you walk by. The air grows thick, as though you're entering another temperature, another time. Real estate agents who've worked inside describe an inexplicable sensation. The sound of footsteps pacing overhead when the house is empty. The flicker of shadows in broad daylight. And once, a faint voice caught on a voicemail recording. A whisper saying, "Don't." There's an idea in parapsychology that some places absorb emotion like film absorbs light. That trauma can etch itself into walls, replaying endlessly, invisible but not gone. If that's true, then 120 The Ocean Avenue is not haunted. It's scarred. Think of the layers. The laughter of children before 1974. The screams no one heard. The prayers whispered during the blessing. The arguments. The voices that may have never been voices at all. They all exist at once, like echoes stacked in the same corridor. And when the night is quiet enough, those echoes leak. There are people who've claimed to hear music when standing near the property. Faint organ tones drifting from nowhere. Others have seen lights flicker in the windows long after midnight. A single bulb glowing, then dimming, as if someone is walking room to room. The current owners, though private, once admitted in a brief interview that they never felt alone there. They laughed after saying it, but their eyes didn't. You start to wonder, if a place witnesses enough horror, does it begin to think? Does it grow a kind of memory, a mind shaped by what it has absorbed? And if it does that mind dream, the DeFeo murders, the Lutz haunting, the investigations, they're chapters in the same nightmare. Each generation tries to explain it away, but the story refuses to die. It feeds quietly on attention, on fear, on the retelling itself. Some say that's how the curse works. Not through ghosts or demons, but through the persistence of memory. Every time someone tells the story, every time a photo of the house is shared, its image is kept alive. It becomes less a place and more an idea that infects other homes, other nights, other sleepless hours. Because somewhere inside that story, you start to hear your own house settling. You start to wonder if that creak upstairs was wood, or something remembering. And then, of course, there's the time. 3:15 a.m. It always comes back to that. Neighbors still say that if you're near Ocean Avenue on a cold night and you glance at the house, one window sometimes glows faintly at that exact minute. Just a pale amber light, then gone. No one's inside. The power's off. Yet it happens again and again. You tell yourself it's a coincidence. You tell yourself you don't believe in such things. But when the hour comes, you can't help but listen. That's the power of a story like this. It doesn't need proof. It just needs silence and a willing listener. You. Because the moment you hear it, part of you becomes part of it. The house expands, invisibly, reaching across the space between what happened and what you imagine. And if you listen carefully, really listen, you might notice something right now. That stillness in your own room. That faint shift in the air. The subtle sound that wasn't there before you started reading. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue doesn't need you to believe in it. It just needs you to remember it, because memory is how it survives. So if you ever find yourself driving through Long Island and you pass that white colonial by the canal, the one whose windows used to look like eyes, don't stop, don't stare, and whatever you do, don't check the time, because if it's 3:15, the house is awake again. Lock your doors, turn off the lights, and don't listen too closely, because some stories don't end. They wait.